Hi, I'm comedian Lyndsay Hailey, and you're listening to my magic-filled interview with Elaine Goodman on gogoodman.com.au.
You're a comedian, comedy writer, comedy performer. So the first question I like to start with for comedians, because it really opens them up, is what's the earliest memory you have of comedy having an effect on you?
Ooh, what a brilliant question. Okay, we'll go right for it. But I remember trying to ease tension in my household growing up. I would say that I have a very typical dysfunctional family dynamic. Where like my parents and my sister and everybody, they're incredible, but tensions were high sometimes in the house growing up, and I sort of remember trying to distract people from the seriousness of what was going on by doing some silly stuff. And then I was also a big-time gymnast growing up, and as I'm sure you know, that can be like a very serious environment because I was kind of like, doing sort of pre-Olympic type of training. So I remember in gymnastics practice when we were all sort of expected to be perfect, that I would often be the person sort of like taking the heat from the coaches on purpose, or cracking jokes, or mostly doing like sort of like punks or pranks to sort of like get people not as upset with themselves. I guess there's a lot of pressure you put on yourself in that type of performance dynamic, and so I would always sort of do stuff to like ease tension, I guess.
And where did that, because I guess people, all comedians I've interviewed answer it in a different way. Sometimes it's a certain show they watch, sometimes it's a certain kind of life event, or life time of their life that you're talking about. Do you remember where you actually learnt what comedy was, like where you connected laughter with something you were actually doing, if that makes sense?
Ooh, these are brilliant questions. I do. It's a very weird memory that you're jogging right now, and I can honestly say I've never spoken about it before, but I vaguely remember right now I had about 5 gals I ran around with where we all did gymnastics very competitively, and one of the girls had just gotten in trouble with our coach. We had like a Russian gymnastics coach.
Oh, God. Oh, no.
Named Henry, and I think she had just done like a bar routine, and she biffed the landing, or she did something, and she came back, to get back in line, and she was like crying, and I remember like intentionally sort of like I use a lot of physical comedy, so like to take the heat off of her, I tripped over something on purpose so that he would sort of get mad at me, if that makes sense. And like just kept being defiant on purpose, directing it at the coach so that like everyone would laugh at the situation, and then everything was dissolved. So I was probably 14 when that event happened. And again, I can honestly say I don't think I've thought of it 2 times except for this question right now.
We're off to a good start then.
That's incredible. Yeah.
You grew up in Virginia, but started working as a comedian in Chicago, which has a rich history of comedians, from Steve Allen, who originally hosted The Tonight Show, to Jeff Garlin, and even Robin Williams, I read, was born there, even though he started his career in San Francisco. Can you tell me about the comedy culture in Chicago, or what you remember of it? Back in that, I want to say,
I sure
to not be insulting, I want to say maybe early 90s you were there, or were you there late 80s?
Oh, you're amazing. So it was probably, you're not being insulting at all, late 90s.
Late 90s, okay.
When did
I was
I
way
move?
off.
Forgive me. It's even later than that. I moved there in 2005.
Oh, wow.
And to give you a bit of a perspective on just the Chicago culture, as I'm sure you know, there's a sketch comedy house there because I specialize in improv and sketch comedy. I do some stand-up, and one of my more, a lot of the comedy from my sketch shows has come from my failed attempts at stand-up that I'm like now willing to use publicly in other shows, you know? So it all works for you in the magic comedy soup eventually. But Chicago's history is incredible. I would say that it is the sketch and improv capital of the world. So basically the fielding ground for everyone that's ever come through Saturday Night Live, more or less. With the exception of, again, there's some sketch comedy schools in Los Angeles as well and in New York, but the mother hub that all of these schools were founded off of started in Chicago. And so in the 50s, I believe, there's a founding group called the Compass Players, which would then become the Second City. And I studied at the Second City in Chicago, both just a regular conservatory program and was one of the first graduating classes of the musical conservatory program there. I also paralleled that track with my study at I.O., which used to be formerly Improv Olympic, underneath the tutelage of Sharna Halpern, whose partner used to be Del Close, who passed away in the late 90s or mid-90s. But that's an improv house, and Second City is known to be a sketch comedy house. So if you're cutting your teeth in Chicago, you kind of play at all of the sketch and improv schools to sort of like, just like to cut your teeth. So I was performing at the Annoyance Theater, I.O. Theater, and the Second City. And the history there is just absolutely incredible. I mean, again, everyone from Chris Farley, Tina Fey, Mike Myers, Stephen Carell, Stephen Colbert, all of these are people who have come through the Second City and I.O. in Chicago.
So is there, I guess...
So that time there was incredible.
So is there, like, a kind of place where they acknowledge all those people? Like, a dream of mine is to go to the Comedy Store in LA and to Dangerfields in New York. And when I've seen pictures, they have pictures all over the walls of people who have performed there all the way back to Jerry Seinfeld and even before him. Are there places in Chicago that kind of acknowledge that history of who's come through their doors?
Yes, there is. So the Second City and I.O. I.O. again was founded more in the 80s, so you get a really rich history and sense from like about Chris Farley era on. So, the pictures in I.O. Chicago, they have a new theater now, but, when you walk into that theater, the pictures that line the wall from these just incredible comedians when they were on what we call a Herald team, which is basically right after you get out of classes there, you're thrown on a team with about 8 to 10 other people. So you see all of these sort of like student show group pictures that happen to have like Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, Chris Farley in them. It's pretty unreal. And then the Second City also, and that history dates back a little bit deeper, so again to the 50s, but if you go through, it's lining the hallways there. There's a bar across the street from the Second City called the Old Town Ale House that to me is probably everything you're looking for. So if you ever make it to Chicago, you've got to go check that out, because on the walls, there's even paintings of some of these different comedians, because that's the bar that they would go to across the street after they finished their Second City sets. So it's pretty incredible.
As a young comedy writer, performer, and director, and I guess in sketch comedy and improv, you've got to be a bit more specific, kind of where you want your career to go. Maybe is the dream to work in New York, LA, or Vegas? Because I know they each offer different opportunities for comedians, but I'm not sure where kind of sketch and improv comedy leads you.
Amazing. To answer that, I never in a million years thought that I would end up in Las Vegas, Nevada. That was not the dream. But such is life, I had, as a matter of fact, I'd never even set foot in Las Vegas until I got the job. So my initial start was trying to get it going in Chicago, and then I obviously was gunning right for Saturday Night Live. So I've auditioned for them a couple of times and was flown out to New York. And since my family's from Virginia, that's on the East Coast of the United States, so I thought, moving to New York, still being relatively close to family, at least like a train ride away, that would be nice. So when I set out for Chicago, in my head, I was going to be there for about 2 or 3 years. And then I was immediately going to get snatched up for Saturday Night Live, and then I would be whisked away to New York. And Elaine, that has yet to happen.
You're still young.
But yeah, I'm so young, and I sound even younger than I am, according to my friend in Australia. So I ended up staying in Chicago for about a decade. I was there for 9 years studying, and then after the SNL thing got close and didn't take, I decided to move to Los Angeles. So I was very open to being in New York or LA. I was in LA for about 3 years doing some work and still teaching at, there's an IO theater out in Los Angeles. So there's a second city in Chicago, a second city and an IO in Chicago, and then there's a second city and an IO in Los Angeles. Now, they kind of default because the other schools out in LA kind of reign supreme. So UCB in Los Angeles is what IO is to Chicago, and the Groundlings in Los Angeles is what the second city is to Chicago. So those schools in LA kind of are the kings of Los Angeles. And then in New York, UCB is also kind of king. There is no IO out in New York. And so you kind of learn based on the different sort of improv style or sketch style, like what city you should go to study. And so out in Los Angeles, like I had kind of not put my sketch and improv away. I was still teaching improv, but was going more into comedy film. And my boss, Sharna, over at IO in Chicago, sent me this audition notice for this Magic Mike Live thing. So I was living in LA at the time when I got notification about this job, and then it was just sort of like, why not? But Las Vegas was never in my mind as part of my comedy path.
Right. And it's okay that you sound young. I usually sound younger than I am when I don't have such a croaky voice, but this is really good. I'm glad I brought the croakiness today.
Yeah, you sound extremely young.
No, but I've spoken to comedians before that have said that New York is a lot more, I guess, encouraging and a lot more sympathetic to young comedians. Like as a stand-up, you get paid a lot more in New York than you do in LA, because in LA they're expecting that your stand-up is going to lead to a movie career, so they don't pay you as much in the early stages. But in New York, they really respect stand-up comedians for what they do.
That's amazing. Yeah, I can see LA does feel more like you wait until you're somewhat established, like I don't know that that's a rule overall, but it would seem that like all of my comedy friends who are kind of making it now, we all cut our teeth in either New York or Chicago before moving to LA, because it does seem like if you're a bit more established before you move to LA that you will get work, but that, yes, it's not necessarily like the place to go learn it, or so it seems. And I think that would be true for like stand-up as well as sketch and improv.
So before we move on to more technical kind of comedy styles and all the things you've done, and a bit more about even comedy history, I want to know, and I ask this to a lot of comedians, especially American comedians that have come up through a couple of different decades, who was in your comedy clique when you started?
In my comedy, that's very cool.
So who were your friends in the comedy industry?
That's beautiful. And again, I think I'm an interesting one to ask this question to, because over on your side of the world, I believe some of my comedy clique, if they're not household names yet, they will be. So this will be a fun thing to answer. So because I was teaching improv for such a long time, I had a lot of international improv students come to IO in Chicago for summer intensive. So I have the comedy clique, if you will, that I went through classes with, and then the comedy clique that I ended up teaching, and through teaching them was like, whoa, like there's something magical here, and then we started to work together as well. So I went through Second City and IO at the same time as a couple of names that you probably know of now. TJ Miller was just a year, I think, ahead of me. So we all sort of performed together. Like we were touring at the same time. Tom Thomas Middleditch was also just a year ahead of me. So they've also continued to work together on Silicon Valley. And one of my other friends is a best buddy is a man named Blaine Swin, and he's the founder of the Improvised Shakespeare Company. And so Thomas Middleditch works with Blaine and, you know, a host of other people who, again, if they're not household names, they will be. So my comedy clique has kind of consisted of those fellows, or we were kind of in the same 2 to 3 years coming out of those programs. I'm trying to think of who else would be a household name already. But again, some people yet to fully pop off yet, but that will be. There's a gal pal that came through IO with me. Her name is Irene Marquette, and she's working pretty closely with Kay Cannon now, who's the writer of Pitch Perfect 1 through 3. And so she's doing a lot of female-forward comedy and more on the writing, directing side, but we came through together, and I think that's a name that you'll hear of. And then my international comedy buddies, again, let's see. So Steen Raskopoulos, Susie Youssef, and a woman named Erin Foy, who, again, I think Erin will prove to be more of a writer-director type in the future. Steen Raskopoulos is already doing a bunch of things on the BBC, and, again, Steen and Susie are together on Whose Line Is It Anyway in Australia. So I feel like my comedy family is this international family, and in about 5 years or so, all of my best comedy buddies, I think, will be hopefully like a different type of international comedy platform that has yet to sort of be created yet, you know, so that people will know of them.
So you're the link of the next big comedy boom, is what you're saying.
Elaine, that's really ballsy. But you know what? Yes, I do believe that. I can say that because I feel so strongly about how incredibly gifted they are, and I do happen to know every single one of them, you know? That's very cool. Yeah, is that bragging? I don't know. I don't know if it's bragging when you're basically relying on the gifts and talents of other people.
I think you said it. It's ballsy.
Yeah, it's ballsy. That's probably the exact word for me and everything I'm about.
I love this.
I should add another name in there because I think this guy, 2 other names, that, you know, one of them has been on Jimmy Fallon as a stand-up and stuff, but they will break. But 2 of my best comedy buddies are a man named Mort Burke and a man named Nick Vatterott. And they also came through Chicago with me, and then we've since sort of like rekindled and worked on things in LA. But I believe Nick Vatterott is like, you know, how there's certain sort of like comedy personas that like exist and sort of reincarnate. And I think he's the closest thing to Robin Williams that I think exists right now. He's like a cross between Robin Williams and Don Knotts, if that can exist.
So what was his name again?
His name is Nick Vatterott.
Nick Vatterott. Okay, I'm going to look him up. We need another Robin Williams.
It's Vatterot. And then Mort Burke, Mortburke. So Mort is on a show here in the United States called Drunk History every once in a while. But both of these men, I believe, again, they'll be household names. It's just a matter of time. And I'm very fortunate to have like shared stages with them anywhere.
We need a household person with the name Mort. We don't get very many Morts.
Yeah. I know, right?
I think it's a very American name.
It'd be good for everyone.
I've read that you do all forms.
Oh, there's one more. I keep leaving people out, but there's another guy named Lance Allen. And I didn't meet him until LA, but I'm basically giving you all the names. I want this to serve as sort of like a weird comedy prophecy, because I feel like people in 10 years might listen to this again and be like, whoa. Because it's probably just before their household names, but I think you can take this to the bank. Elaine. It's Lance Allen, Mort Burke, Nick Vatterott, Lyndsay Hailey, Dean Riskopoulos, Susie Youssef, and Aaron Foy. I think those are all names you'll hear about comedically if you haven't already.
This is the start of your clairvoyancy career, Lyndsay.
Exactly. I'll be a crossover artist.
I've read that you do all forms of comedy. You do sketch, stand-up comedy, obviously sketch comedy, and improv. What are the differences between these forms, and what are the biggest challenges of each?
Okay, beautiful. Okay.
Let's go a bit deeper.
Let's go a bit deeper. Let's start with improv, because in the past, improv was used as like an acting tool, right? So improv back in the day, right, was basically created by Viola Spolin, or it's accredited as being created by Viola Spolin and Uta Hagen. And it was a tool for actors to sort of become more emotional with their scripts. And then it was also a tool in children's theater to just sort of like play with the imagination. So in the 80s is when it started sort of becoming a viable form of comedy onto itself. So like improv, again, people used it as an acting tool, and then in the 80s they were like, well, maybe this is marketable and impressive, you know, if there are paying audiences of people who are coming to see this like just off the cuff, because that's amazing. If it's completely unplanned, people are aware that they're seeing something being made up before their very eyes, and it's still super funny. But improv itself is not improv comedy. So there's two distinctions there, right? Improv comedy maps on this whole other idea that we call yes and it's sort of this code that no matter what improv school you take, no matter if you take sketch comedy at the Second City or the Groundlings or IO or UCB or the Annoyance, we all live by this code called yes and, which means that we're not just up there making stuff up on the spot. We're up there unified by the universal law that we have to agree to say yes and to whatever our scene partner throws at us. And that's where the comedy comes from, because obviously in real life we want to say no to everything. And when we stifle momentum or say no to something, it doesn't end up funny. It usually ends up pretty dang dramatic, right? So that's a distinction between improv and improv comedy, is this law of yes, as well as some other guidelines or rules that over time the art form has become even more refined. So the obvious challenge that comes with that, improvising live, is the human condition wants to say no. It's easier to say no. It's easier to fight. When we're nervous, fighting is one of our first responses, because when you're fighting or you're in a cyclical pattern of yes, I did, no, I didn't, yes, I did, no, I didn't, then you can kind of control what's about to come out of you. You know what the next obvious line is. When you fall deeply into this yes and psychology, you genuinely have no idea what you're about to say, and it's kind of like jumping out of an airplane, but you're doing it publicly in front of paying customers and hoping that you land on something that's funny. And so the obvious challenge there is fighting your own sense of judgment up there, fighting your own ideas of what you think other people will think is funny. Like, judgment has no place on an improv stage, so you have to just be willing to say yes to whatever. You have to believe that your scene partner is an artist, a genius, and a poet at all times. And obviously that can be challenging, right? It's not because we're human beings and we do have judgment. So I would say that the greatest thing about improv is that when you can be in that state of total yes and no judgment of yourself or your scene partners, you will create the funniest thing that you've ever been a part of and the funniest thing that an audience will have ever seen, because there's so much magic involved. Not only are you not censoring yourself, but you're also doing it live in front of people. So hopefully, again, the greatest thing about improv is that you're flying blind, and then the scariest, most challenging thing about improv is that you're flying blind, So to that bit of history, I think, kind of leads us into sketch comedy, which is that improv is also used as a tool to develop good sketch comedy. So if you take classes at the Second City or the Groundlings, by the time you're done with the entire program, you will put up what we refer to as a sketch review, which is very similar in structure to Saturday Night Live in the way that it's a bunch of sort of scenes or vignettes or character-based comedy. But a lot of these sketches were generated out of doing improv in classes. So if you take a suggestion of anything at all and it's two people on a stage and you get cauliflower, and then one of the scene partners comes up with this hilarious little kid character who, refuses to eat anything white, if in class you've noticed through improvising that is like a hysterical character, then you might be inspired to start writing sketches about that character and put that character in different places. And then once you really learn the character through improv, it's easy to write sketches. So the greatest thing about sketch comedy to me, two things. I love characters, and once you've really tapped into a character, and I feel like sketch comedy, it's a little bit safer, right? You've probably tested these characters out through your improv and gotten to know them pretty well and can relate to them so well that, basically writing a sketch about them, if you're confident enough about the character, which you probably will be, will definitely work. So I guess the greatest challenge about sketch for me is that if you're a real, true improviser, and I am, memorizing lines and not, and being beholden to a script can sometimes be challenging because the show I'm in now, per se, in Las Vegas, it's a scripted show, and I'm allowed to play inside the lines a little bit, but the improviser in me definitely knows she can cut loose a lot more than she is, and I'm not always allowed to. So for me, sketch comedy sometimes can feel a little inhibiting. And that's just my personal answer because I'm sure that there's some people who don't feel that way at all about it. That being said, though, I love the sort of guaranteed success of sketch comedy, which again is small vignettes or sketches, scripts, usually between 1 minute to 5 minutes in length, that explore a character or a political theme, and it's basically your you can make a sketch show that's sort of your greatest hits. Stand-up, to me, is probably the scariest. So the greatest asset about stand-up is that you are completely in control, in a way. I mean, obviously there's an audience, but you're in charge of your own material. Unlike sketch or improv, especially if it's ensemble sketch or improv, you're relying on other people inside of an ensemble-based dynamic, which is to say that, if your scene partner's having a bad day or their personal life is sort of creeping into their improv, or vice versa, it's a collaborative or truly collaborative process. So the best and worst thing about stand-up, again, is that you're alone, meaning, in my opinion, that you're completely self-reliant. And so that's an amazing thing because you can control your own content and the concepts that you think are amazing. But when you fall short or your energy is off, you really have no one to blame but yourself, because one of the greatest rules of comedy, in my opinion, is you never blame the audience, And so if your stand-up doesn't hit that night, it's probably 100% you. And so I think that's the best worst thing about it is that it's a bit more controlled because you're controlling it, and at the same time you can't really, you're not in it with anyone else, which also means in a sketch or an improv scene there are super fun moments where maybe it doesn't start out hot and then something organic might happen that raises the vibe of both you and your scene partner, and then all of a sudden you've done this with this other person, you've kind of come out of the mud together, and that's also really, really fun. And the same thing can happen alone in stand-up, but again, you can't really, you can't really blame anybody else. I think I probably made that point, but hopefully that covered all three.
15 minutes later.
Improv
Wow.
and stand-up. And I probably talked for so long, but I am such a comedy nerd.
I love it. This is what I want. Obviously, well, not obviously, but I'm assuming improv is something anybody can do because it requires very little preparation. You obviously need to learn all the theories that you just mentioned, but going onto stage, apart from the chemistry, there's nothing else that you can really prepare for. And I've read that you've taught improv all over the world, including the UK, Belgium, France, Sweden, and even here in Australia. How do you adapt your lessons to each country when topical issues are different, cultures are different, priorities are different, etc.?
Amazing. Your questions are incredible.
This is what I do.
So I get to teach, really. It's what you do. It's what you do. And I will say this, I felt spoiled everywhere I've ever been because I suppose that the epicenter of improv did come from the United States, right? I mean, I wouldn't want to claim that. I know that there's some people that claim that Keith Johnstone was first, and albeit, but I guess I should say English-speaking countries. So I have been so spoiled in that, bless these amazingly intelligent souls, which I will say that in America, we are not multilingual, we're not bilingual. And when I go to France, they will improvise for me in English, which is so crazy to me. When obviously Australia, there's not as much of a roadblock there. But everywhere I've been all over the world, these people are incredibly brilliant and often have been bilingual, if not tri and quadrilingual in some instances. But the coolest thing I can say is that I don't really adopt my teaching psychology based on what's going on as far as like pop culture or political relevance, because the students inside those cultures, it will ooze and eke out of them. So as far as a teaching style goes, I basically just have to teach them how to be present, which is very difficult. But it's mostly about eye contact, connection, willingness, retraining that brain programming, if you will, to say yes instead of no. So because that fundamentally doesn't change, once those gears are in place and they're saying yes to each other's ideas, that includes with it, whatever is relevant in those specific societies. And so it does make my job kind of easy. Obviously, I try to be as well-read and well-versed as I can, so I don't want to just sound like a big dumb when I go over to Belgium. I think other societies they work harder than we do at, I would say that stereotype about America is correct, and it's something that I hope that we are trying to change as a culture, but I don't see it changing anytime soon, And so just as a human being, I try to be as knowledgeable as I can about the places that I'm going to, but it's typically, as far as lessons go and improv goes, it's mostly about teaching people how to get out of their own way emotionally, and that is a universal language.
So it's more about the people rather than what they're talking about. You can always learn about the different references they make in their improv, but teaching them to dig deeper, that's a universal language.
Yes, exactly. And that comedy is such a brilliant way to study that, right? Because, and I'll give you hopefully a little fun comedy nugget here, which is that 99.9% of the time you're laughing at connection, not what's actually being said, right? And so, if someone has a very smart reference that comes from their mental body, that's excellent. That's what we would refer to as icing on the cake, right? But, imagine a silent comedy scene where the two people aren't allowed to talk, or let's say it's a guy and a girl in an elevator, and they clearly have the hots for one another, right? But they're nervous to talk to each other. You would die laughing at that, and it wouldn't matter what language they were speaking. You would still be able to see, sense, and feel that sort of comedic tension, right? And so getting people to ride those waves of energy or emotion, if you will, that's probably if I've had success as a teacher, it's because that's sort of my wheelhouse, if you will. And then we go back on and we add those sort of cerebral references. But to me, the most important thing is that connection first.
My God, I really want to do one of your classes. Are you coming back here soon?
You gotta come. I mean, if you do one of my classes, it would seem that you would get hired immediately to whose line is it anyway in Australia, because every single one of them has been a student of mine.
Your current gig, I believe, is as the MC for the stage show version of Magic Mike in Las Vegas. So that's the job that you've been referring to a couple of times in Las Vegas, which was created by Channing Tatum. What does that role involve?
It's ridiculous. It's the best thing ever. So yes, I'm the female MC inside of a male dance review that, based on our marketing, one would just think it's a male strip show. Meaning, like, it is, because Magic Mike the movies are very female forward and very sexy, and this show is the exact same thing. So I would say that my role in that show is to take women on a journey into exploring their sexuality in a very safe and funny way, where we don't apologize for it, and we kind of, inhabit our deepest sort of sexual fantasies as an audience together each night.
Are you the only female in the show?
There is, there's one other female who is a dancer in the show, and I can't give too much else away about that. But I'm the only female speaker, if you will. So
is that your day job, or is that in between writing? And I read, like, you've also got your own show that you're trying to get up and going. So how many jobs do you actually have at the moment?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I guess if we're talking about just self-created jobs, I probably have 47. But it is my sort of steady. If you will, that's as close to a desk job as I'll ever have, right? So it's like my steady gig that sort of supplies me with a base so that I can continue to write and do all the other stuff that you were talking about.
I want to go back a little bit into comedy history, because I haven't interviewed a lot of female comedians before. I've interviewed a lot of male comedians, and I'm assuming they'd have a different kind of interpretation of comedy history. So women haven't always been so prevalent in comedy as they are today. From my research, the boom of the 80s and even before that was filled with guys like Don Rickles, Rodney Dangerfield, George Carlin, through to Robin Williams, Eddie Murphy, Adam Sandler and his mates, and Jerry Seinfeld. The earliest notable female comedian I can think of is Roseanne. Have females in general struggled to get into comedy in the past?
I just got chills. Okay, great question again.
Let's go back.
I love
this
boom.
Pose
it like that.
I love this boom, this comedy boom.
So I think if you're the comedy masses and you're equating comedy to stand-up comedy, right? Mm-hmm. I'm one of these. I'm a lady who likes to be like, guys, gals, let's stop saying that it's been hard for women, so that we can have it not be hard for us. But I would be remiss to say that obviously, I think for women to step forward and allow themselves to be as funny as they are, there's so much sociologically that kind of has to happen for us to break down those walls to put ourselves in that situation. So to me, there's earlier female comedians that I love. Phyllis Diller, Carol Burnett, Gilda Radner was probably one of your first sort of in the late 70s, I guess, on the first incarnation of Saturday Night Live. So there's some women that track back even deeper. Obviously, Lucille Ball. Let's see, who am I trying to think of? Gracie Allen and George Burns, right? So there's there's women that you might not know about if you're shopping only inside of stand-up comedy to find female comedians. I would say that this female comedy boom that we're in now feels really good, right? Because even though there are some female comedians, I think, that date back to even, God knows when. They've kind of always been there, but the fact that we're so loud and proud and strong right now is very cool, And I think you asked was, like, is it difficult for us to be comedians, really? Is that sort of...
Well, I don't know. It seems, well, from my perspective, it seems like it's a very male-dominated a dominated field, and maybe that's because I don't know how to put this, but, like, maybe males have a lot more range of topics that they can cover, and yet still be respected for it. I don't know if that makes sense, but they might have a bit more of a range. Yeah. If it makes sense in my head, but usually what makes sense in my head doesn't make sense everywhere else.
You're amazing. I think you're willing to say something out loud that maybe a lot of people aren't, right? Which makes sense in my head, too. What I will say is I believe you can get away with anything if you approach it without apology, right? And perhaps because of the subjugation of women, like you said, we may not have felt like there is as much that we could cover without apology, because probably one of the tenets of comedy is that, you have to bring to light social issues that other people are kind of unwilling to talk about and poke fun at the human psyche, right? And so, even with regards to this show that I'm in right now, like a woman at the helm of a bunch of men who are taking off their clothes. Like, this is a complete gender role reversal, right? Where for all of history, it's been a man doing what I'm doing and a bunch of women taking off their clothes around the man. And so I think we're at a point in history where we're at the great tipping point, where everything is becoming equal and an honest playing ground where we can explore these things because women are willing to do it without apology. So I am not super into, like, pointing the finger of blame at men or anybody else for, like, why women haven't been as in the forefront of comedy as they are now. I'm just happy that we're there now, if that makes sense.
So I guess that aspect of not wanting to apologize is an interesting point, especially for some of the big comedians of today, especially Amy Schumer, who's really prevalent. Sarah Silverman, Margaret Cho, and Jen Kirkman are the ones that come to mind that are American. But if we focus on Amy Schumer, I'm a big fan of her movies, and whenever she's on a talk show, she is great right off the cuff. She's brilliant because she's not scared of she's not scared of saying anything. But in her stand-up can be, for lack of a better term, really crude. Do you? And that's why I'm not such a big fan of her stand-up. Do you think that's something she has to do to get out there, or do you think that's just her style and what she's comfortable talking about?
I think, here's how I can answer that delicately, because obviously if Amy Schumer ever heard this, I would want her to be my friend.
No, tread carefully. But I think it's an interesting topic because there are female comedians that go above and beyond to be that to have that kind of shock, to get that kind of shock value in their routines, and whether they feel like they have to do it or they're actually comfortable doing it because that's what they're comfortable talking about, or they feel like that's what people are going to react to. I think that can be two totally separate things.
I agree. So to me, that's often based like individual performance, right? And the audience response, or how the audience feels, is like the most amazing litmus test. You bring up an interesting point, and probably one of my favorite points to talk about as a female comedian, because I personally charge myself with the task of I agree that Amy Schumer can be brazen and lewd, and it's not my style. I believe that I talk about the same issues that she talks about, but I do it from my feminine energy versus my masculine energy. But I will say that comedians like Amy Schumer or even Tina Fey, to me, about 10 years ago specifically, as they were on the forefront of this sort of paving the way for other lady comedians, they maybe got into a habit of playing inside the boys' club in order to get noticed. And I think we're at a time now where if they wanted to relax that muscle, they could, and they would still be accepted for their more feminine-driven comedic points, if that makes sense. And it's bad to. I could go into this. I could write a dissertation on this, which I love, because I don't like polarizing things with gender titles. But over time, men have been known as more of a mental processor and women more emotive, right? Whether you agree with that or not, it's kind of a stereotype that exists about our genders. And so it's not something I really want to believe in or further, because I think we're hitting a point in time where gender roles are flipping. Women are exploring their masculine side as much as their feminine side, and men are exploring their feminine side as much as their masculine side. So just sort of like give these definitions doesn't really serve us anymore. But for the purpose of talking about the past and getting to where we are now, I feel that, when I studied Tina Fey's comedy at Second City, because I was inside her touring company that she toured in 10 years before I got there, right? I feel like I can track, a lot of her comedy as being more mental driven. And then if you watch her maturation as a comedian, now she does more emotionally driven content.
And if you look at some of her more recent movies as well. When she was trying to prove herself at the
beginning, what's that?
And if you look at some of her more recent movies as well, it's kind of steering away from that kind of one-liner humor. It's going more kind of emotional humor, as you mentioned, and more emotional topics.
Exactly. And I think Amy Schumer, if I can, isn't quite there yet, right? She wants to be. I definitely think she will head there in her evolution. I think she's working at it all the time. But once you learn how to be one of the boys and get affirmation from the guys inside of like a comedy dynamic as being able to like bat back and forth with them pound to pound, it's hard to break those comedic habits as well, if that makes sense. And so I think just if I was like analyzing her, and again, I don't know, you can choose carefully what you do and don't want to say, but I've suffered from a lot of the same stuff, like, and I shouldn't, because Amy Schumer, I don't think is suffering comedically, but I know that I have a tendency to sort of crutch on my boy style of play instead of really stepping forward as a feminine voice inside of the comedy world. It's actually easier for us to sort of do that mental play, if that makes sense, because it's, I think, really ballsy and really vulnerable to try to generate laughs based on emotion. So hopefully that, but I'm with you. Like, my personal style is not to, I feel like I'm on a quest as a female comedian to attempt to be funny gracefully. And it is difficult because you can tell a good dick joke and be a woman who is not afraid to do that with as much bravado as a man, and you do get rewarded for it in a weird way because it's different.
Does it matter where that reward's coming from, whether it's from just because you're a female and saying dick, so saying the word dick or making reference to it, does it matter if it's coming from that or whether it's coming because the joke is like legit funny?
Right.
Does that make a difference? Does it matter? Does it matter where the laugh comes from?
I would almost say no. Right. It's like, because again, your audience is paramount. So some people's sense of humor that you might be playing to, you know, because it's also subjective, right? Like, I would say no. I would say it almost doesn't matter. So me as a comedian is going to be a little bit different than her, but there are probably people in the world, as you well know, that think that when she's doing that it's the funniest thing in the world, you know? So I would say probably, yeah, it doesn't really matter. I go with that old saying, laughter is the best medicine. I really believe that. And, you know, different laughs are going to come from different styles. So I guess we shouldn't really care at all.
And I guess in radio, there's kind of a similar belief. I mean, the term shock jock doesn't really float well in Australia, as in, well, specifically in Melbourne. I mean, the biggest shock jock in the world is Howard Stern, and I can respect his success, but how he got there is something that I can't really respect as, I guess, artistic radio, because it's just going on shock value and how much work he's actually put into, you know, research and content creation rather than just going for the shock and going for the for the people that like the shock. It's not something that I can really relate to, or something that really kind of works for me, or works even in Australia that much. So whether it's an American thing,
got it, yeah.
That might be it, because there's a lot more channels that you can go through to find different radio hosts that you like. There's a lot more variety. But in Australia, it's not something, even that celebrity lifestyle is kind of, it's not as focused on as it is in America. If someone, there's very few people that come to Australia and get like a celebrity kind of welcome, I think. Yes, they're all going to have fans, but whether they're all going to be crazy fans like Justin Bieber's fans, there's very few people that can inspire that kind of craziness that come to Australia.
I think you bring up an amazing point. You know, it's like, you know, again, personally, it's not my taste. I feel like I do some shocking things, but I feel like it's typically, here's how I can, I guess, expand on that is, I think in an individual performer, you can feel when they are truly, truly comfortable with their own content versus when they're even a little bit unsure about their delivery. And I tend to think that an audience typically turns on a comedian when the comedian themselves is not fully unapologetic or comfortable with the content that they're dispensing.
So an audience can tell.
An audience can absolutely tell. So, like Bob Saget, you know, when he did, what am I trying to think of that? What does it start? It starts with an A. Aristocrat. Yeah. To me, he was brazen and so unapologetic that it was hysterical, because it was so lewd and so over the top, but you could absolutely feel his own confidence inside it. That, to me, that goes beyond shock comedy. That goes into a willingness to show human beings an aspect of the human condition that not many people are willing to do. But I am with you. When I watch Amy Schumer, sometimes I get uncomfortable because I feel that she's uncomfortable. Right?
Yeah.
But like Richard Pryor, for example, was never uncomfortable with any of his horrific content, or it was very rare that he was.
Oh, and so Robin Williams could be Robin Williams could be as dirty as anybody. I've seen Robin Williams on stage, and I saw him with my mum actually, and that like, he was brilliant, but he touched on some very crude points as well. But he just owned it. He owned a stage.
Exactly. So I think an audience. I think again the best litmus test is us as audience members. You know, and if you do feel put off, it's probably because they're not fully in line with what they're delivering, is how I feel. Now, that could be our own blocks, too, as audience members watching, so we have to be open to that as well, right? Like, obviously, if you had a traumatic past and there's a stand-up comedian there doing jokes about something that relates to you, you could shut down and not receive it well. But, like, you know, having that conversation with yourself about why you do or don't resonate with content, you know? And I think that's art in general, right?
And I guess in saying that's something you can't blame the comedian for.
Exactly, because if she's willing to, in a way, if she's willing to go up there and be slightly uncomfortable but deliver it, it's also showing us an aspect of ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm. And
Here's this woman on the forefront of all comedy, and she's still a little afraid to really push it all out there.
I guess, I've watched most of Sarah Silverman's recent stand-up special on Netflix, and when I think about it now, when I compare it to Amy Schumer, it's a lot more relatable. There are crude jokes, but it's not ongoing. There's a lot of relatable topics that she covers, and I guess that is a sign that maybe she's a bit more mature than Amy Schumer. She's a little bit older. She's like a decade earlier, but maybe that is a sign of maturity, comfortability on stage. I
agree. I wholeheartedly agree. Any good actor or artist knows, right, that it's like the uncovering of their authentic self that leads to the best acting or comedy. So, you know, if you're really doing that sort of self-work to remove all of your own blocks, and then you're willing to be that authentic on stage, I think that's when healing or magic or laughter can happen, you know? And so, yeah, I would just say she might be in an interesting part of that sort of self-excavation, you know? Whereas, again, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Sarah Silverman is really doing the work, you know?
What's your comedy dream? Is it to work with a certain person? Is it to work on a certain project? I know you're working on your own production at the moment, or is it longevity in general?
You know, that's beautiful. I think it's longevity in general for me, but it wasn't always that. And then as I age, I think it's sort of autonomy and, like, being willing to have my own production entity where I don't need to jump through hoops to produce the content I want to produce. So, you know, I've written a screenplay, and I'd like to produce that in the near future, and things like that. And I am still in a bit of a position where I'm not, like, completely, you know, I'm not big enough yet to be able to just fund my own film or something like that, right? And so for me, I feel like that would be the dream, to, when I have an idea, to have my own means of being able to execute that idea in the creative style that I want to do it. And then, yeah, longevity is nice, but I like old school comedy a lot, and I think we're in an interesting wave of, like, the sitcom kind of dying and stuff like that. And
don't say that.
I guess I'm probably into the. What was that, Eileen?
Yeah, don't say that. I know what you mean, but don't say the sitcom is dying.
Well, no, I don't want it to, right? Because I feel like I am somebody who has been bred to execute that. So what I was going to say was that I feel like I am sort of into the historic preservation of comedy styles. And, you know, because I hearken, I think, mostly to some more sort of throwback type of comedians or some older styles of comedy, and I'd like to keep those alive, you know. So that's a goal. That's a goal of mine.
Let's throw in a bit of a off the cuff question before we finish up. Who's gonna play you in your biopic, or are you gonna play yourself? Well, you can't play yourself. Who's gonna play you in your biopic?
Oh man, you know, I'd let Jennifer Lawrence do it.
You'd let her do it,
but again, I'd let her. I'd allow it. But then I also think, again, like, I wouldn't mind taking a stab at it. But if it happens 30 years from now, who knows? But yeah, I like Jennifer Lawrence a lot. I think she's real hip. You know? I feel like she's really comfortable in her own skin for her age, and I'm into that. So And I think she's got some real comedy chops, you know.
Which brings up an interesting point. Who's going to
She's
play?
willing to be that real.
Who's going to play me in your biopic?
Right? My friend Richard Bell, who also lives in Australia.
Oh yeah. I've also been
Yeah.
I've also been likened to Johnny Lovitz or Danny DeVito, but let's go with your guy.
We should go with him. Danny DeVito is hysterical, though. I maybe want you to go with that just for the scene in the movie that we would have together as Jennifer Lawrence and Danny DeVito.
Wouldn't that be a brilliant combination?
Truly.
And
Truly.
finally, the last topic that I love covering with everybody, whether they're comedian or actor or journalist or anybody, is social media. How has social media changed? How has social media changed comedy? This is a whole nother kettle of fish, and be aware that I start work in 2.5 hours, so go for it.
So again, about the preservation. I know. Do we have a year about the preservation of like the historical aspects of comedy? Right.
And this is a whole nother topic because
It's
this is what
changing
talk
the
shows,
timing of comedy.
This is what talk shows cover on all the time. They're going off social media content and tweets, and it's totally changed the landscape of the talk show as well.
Yeah, it's changing the landscape of everything. And I would say for somebody like me, I love awkward silence. Most of my comedy career has been based on it and playing the silences and playing long moments, right? And so for me, social media has killed a lot of that because it is about the instant gratification. So it's a really interesting time to be alive in general, but obviously comedy. It's teaching me I should go with the positive aspects. It's teaching me to rely on physical and visual comedy. It's teaching me about the one-liner. It's teaching me about a hard sell up top, which I think can all be things that are applied to longer comedy too. If you were to work backwards and like go from a social media platform, if I get these quick sort of one-offs or quick hits, if you will, and build a user base that likes what I'm doing in that way, then maybe I can bait them into watching a full-length film of mine, But again, I was brought up comedically still in the live theater system where we're allowed to play those moments for minutes to get laughs, And so obviously I think the attention span and the sort of comedy journey you could potentially go on is getting shorter and shorter. And so it is a little sad to me, and I'm very positive. I'm a very positive person, but I will say that does make me a little bit sad. But it's a great challenge to learn how to still be relevant when things are happening so quickly. Is
it harder to be relevant when you have to constantly come up with new things to say because of that need for instant gratification, or that expectation of someone looking for instant gratification on social media? Is it harder to keep maintaining relevance over a long period of time? I would say absolutely, and to me, I will get a big concept, right? I'll still get a big concept, which I think is how I specialize my work. And so then I can chop up that big concept into 1,000 tiny pieces now and do a run out, if that makes sense. So it's like if you were speaking in terms of an editorial, and let's say I just finished shooting a small video series where we did 12 different photographs with some of the guys from the show, and then we did 6 different small videos with them as well. And so now on a social media platform, instead of just eliciting that all at one time, I have 4 months worth of content to leak slowly to try to build an audience base. So to me, I guess I haven't given up my pipe dreams as far as doing things the way I want to do them, but I've had to amend the implementation strategy to match what's going on in society. So
to me, I guess the short answer is I don't feel like I'm having to constantly generate new concepts, but I do feel like I have to edit a lot. You know, because like I can still use one concept for like a ton of content. It's just kind of annoying to have to frame it that way and to be sort of aware. I guess this is what annoys me, is that like you're so aware of your popularity in that way. And I'm not really into that. So like, you know, I do a lot of meditating and a lot of like to myself stuff. And I really do believe in like kind of the magic of the universe, if you will. And, to me, I'm hoping I can kind of sidestep that like feeling of need to put all that stuff out there and just keep generating like good magic stuff, and that the right people will follow me or find me anyway, you know. But a lot of people don't do it that way. A lot of people really drive and push, and I really respect that, because that personally is very difficult for me.
So finally, after we've talked about the change of what social media has caused in the comedy industry, whether we think there are good and bad points of it, obviously, where can people find you?
Amazing. I love this. Thank you so much. So I have a website. My name is spelled funny, Elaine, so this makes it kind of complicated, but it's Lyndsay Hailey, Lyndsay. Hailey is Hailey. So I've got Instagram, you know, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. My YouTube, I think, is Chance of Hailey, which should be changing soon, but that's, you know, Chance, CHANCE of Hailey, HAILEY. So I'm like on all the platforms, but because my first name is a bit of a tease, I'm not the easiest person to find.
Believe me, I know what you mean.
Yeah, I know you do. That I in there kind of messes up everything for you internationally, doesn't it?
Exactly. People think it's Elaine. I've been called Elaine, Ellen, Alien. I've had everything.
I'm sure you have.
It's horrible.
Yeah, I guess right now with the new job, I'm using like Instagram more than any other platform at the moment. So.
Lyndsay, it's been so much fun. We've been talking for almost an hour and a half, so thank you for giving me so much time and so much content and so much knowledge and so many interesting stories and facts and opinions. It's been a real pleasure. It's something I really enjoy about doing this, and you've been absolutely fantastic. It's been wonderful, and maybe we can do it again sometime.
Oh, yeah, I would love that, Elaine. Truly, I would absolutely love it. You've been a thrill, and your questions, I love it when they're like real, meaty questions, and so thank you so much.